Hello everyone, my name is Chris Hart and I work for Manchester University Press, and I'm delighted that you're all joining us for what promises to be an excellent armchair event. So we're soon going to begin today's author talk with Gary James, but before we jump in, I'd just like to do a little bit of housekeeping. So firstly, thank you to everyone who has tuned in and is watching this live and interactive armchair event. On your screen, you should see an event dashboard containing a questions option. The questions option is for you to type in questions throughout the talk, which Gary will hopefully get round to answering in the Q&A section at the end. From the events we've run so far, I know that authors really appreciate this Q&A section and the interaction, so please do send in your questions. So as a brief introduction to today's author, Gary James is a specialist in all aspects of football history, with a particular interest in association football in Manchester. He's also the author of the book being discussed today, which is titled The Emergence of Footballing Cultures in Manchester, 1840 to 1919, which is recently published in paperback. So needless to say, Manchester University Press is delighted to be the publisher of The Emergence of Footballing Cultures, which came with endorsements from two of the city's most well-known footballers of recent times, Gary Neville and Vincent Kompany, which is testament to the quality of Gary's writing and research. It's also a very fascinating book, which I found full of insights that really surprised me, given the popularity of football in Manchester and the Northwest. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to Gary, who will talk more about his book.
Hello and welcome. I know it's a difficult time for everyone, so I'm really grateful to all who have joined this chat today. Thanks. Today I'm going to explain about my new book. It's called The Emergence of Footballing Cultures, Manchester 1840 to 1919. And we'll also have time for questions. That's probably going to be the best bit, actually. So if you've got any questions, then please send them in and we can move on from there. If you can move the first slide on, please. Okay, so the aim really is to explain about the book, why it was produced, to read a few sections about Hurst, Ashton United as they became, Newton Heath who became Manchester United, St Mark's who became Manchester City, and they'll give a flavour, really small sections, but they'll give a flavour of what the book's about. Most important point though is I want to sort of crack on with the story if you like, so please feel free to ask any questions you want. As I'm going through the sort of sections I'm going to read, there will be questions. I'm probably going to explain a few bit points now and you're going to think I want to know about that, so please feel free to send them in. If we can move on to the next slide. So one of the key points really is early on, which is worth explaining, is what's Manchester. Manchester city centre is fairly small, and if we're talking about football in Manchester, neither City when we were first formed or Newton Heath, Manchester United as Newton Heath when they were first formed, were based in the city of Manchester. So if I was doing a book purely on the city of Manchester, it wouldn't really tell the story we want to tell. So what I decided was that there's the Manchester FA, when it was first established in 1884, set up what they called the sort of 8-mile rule. And basically they said they catered for every football club within 8 miles of St Anne's Square or St Anne's Church in Manchester. And so I decided that that's loosely what I'd do. I've gone beyond the 8 miles. So for example, Bury Football Club features a great deal in this book. And part of the reason for that is because it's a really interesting story and it actually influences what we know about Manchester. Bury, the actual ground is just outside 8 miles, but I felt it was important to include that. So you'll see that from time to time I sort of move just slightly outside those 8 miles, but it gives you a basic idea. That also means that some of the towns that are traditionally in Cheshire are also included in that 8 miles. People have argued in the past saying that Manchester is a Lancashire-based city, and that's true. But within a short distance of the city centre, you're still in Cheshire. And so it's important that some of those places are included. So hopefully that gives a bit of an idea to that. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So I'm going to start by reading a small section on the football club Hurst. Sorry, no, before I do that, it's worth talking about the very first football club, which was Athenaeum, or Athenaeum as some people like to call them. This is the earliest known association football club in the city. Now, there are stories of association games taking place, but to be honest, 1863 is the year that the FA established its rules. So to talk about association football before 1863 raises lots of questions about whether it's football as we know it today, whether it's something more akin to rugby or what it was. So part of the book explains that and goes into details about that. But UMapp and Nahum are the first team who claimed to play association football, and so they recognised there was a difference in what they played to what some of the rugby clubs, traditional rugby clubs in the area, played. UMapp and Nahum is a really important club, and their existence continues into the 1870s. Next slide, please. And one of the significant aspects about Hume is that as a football club, it lasted probably about 8 years. They didn't play many games because there weren't that many teams in the area. They had to travel to Sheffield quite often to play association football, and sometimes they take part in games which were somewhat confusing. Is it soccer? Is it rugby? Is it a mixture? What is it? But they did survive into the 1870s, and the significant aspect is that some of the people who were involved with that team from 1863 remained involved in football for decades. In fact, a guy called John Nall, who was the first secretary of UMapp and Nahum in 1863, was the guy who presented Newton Heath with their first ever trophy. They became Manchester United, of course, and he was also in the meeting at the Lancashire FA when they, in 1894, when they decided to accept a new club, Manchester City Football Club, into the Lancashire FA. So connecting City and United to that game in that moment in 1863 when UMapp and Nahum was created is really important, and that shows the continuity. So the club itself may not have survived, but the people did, and the people were influential. Okay, if we can move on to the next slide. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to read a small section on Hurst, who in 1878 Hurst was established, and they became Ashton United eventually. But Hurst was really, I would say, the sort of transitional club between teams like Hume and Manchester Association and others that had been established, and the professionalism of what became City and United. So I'll just read this small section. It's primarily talking about influential figures, and before this I talk about John Nall in the book and other influential figures. Another influencer during this period was Jim Ingham from Hurst, who was regarded by many of the leading figures in Manchester's footballing development of the late 1870s and 1880s as one of the architects of the game locally. Ingham was so well known for his commitment to association football that when a reporter was trying to track him down for an interview, he was told to ask the first man you meet in Ashton, and he will tell you. The reporter asked the porter at Ashton train station, and sure enough, he gave directions to Ingham's home almost 2 miles away. As a boy, Ingham had played football in the fields at Hurst, far away over fences and ditch, often by moonlight. And as he developed, he became a centre halfback, standing over 6 feet tall, teetotal for 13 years because he wanted to keep fit, walking 2 miles to work every day, walking at night with the Hurst team for training purposes. He playing 15 seasons without missing a single match. Ingham, he was loved, basically. Ingham was instrumental in the development of Hurst Association Football Club, which was formed in 1878, although some sources claim 1877. I think it's 1878, but some people do say 1877. And he was Hurst secretary and a player from 1878 until 1886. He held a responsible position as check weighman in a local colliery, a role that was often voted for by the workforce or given to a respected, experienced member of staff. Check weighmen were responsible for determining how much coal each worker had mined each day, and therefore how much pay was owed. Men who held these positions were perceived as trustworthy by their fellow workers and often became trade union officials. Ingham, both at work and within footballing circles, was perceived as a positive, honest man contributing to his community. After his playing career ended, he continued to watch Hurst home and away and remained an active committee man. The Hurst region of Ashton-under-Lyne was perhaps the strongest area for association football in the entire Manchester conurbation at the time. Earlier chapters have discussed ad hoc activities of both Hurst and Ashton, and that activity in the 1840s and 1850s helped to encourage men like Ingham to perceive association football as a natural sporting activity. Multiple clubs were developed in Hurst during the 1870s and 1880s. Utilising a long-range framework, it is evident that individual footballing events during earlier decades did lead to a more rapid transition to soccer than was experienced in central Manchester. Hurst contains several mills and factories, but despite the industry, it retained a village-like existence and was surrounded by fields. The combination of potential spaces for recreation, a dedicated working-class community, and the idea of sporting competition created an appropriate environment for team sport to develop. Ingham was at Hurst from the time of its formation, when the differences between the codes, rugby, association, and so on, were still being established locally. And he remembered that the game was much more physical at that time than it was in the 1900s. We used our shoulders, and there was no ankle tapping. Referees let you charge a man in those days. Football was much more physical, of course. One of Ingham's favourite games was against Blackburn Rovers. If anyone's watched the English game that's been on recently, I'm going to mention one of the players now. So one of his favourite games was against Blackburn Rovers when Fergie Souter played. I never saw a finer back than Fergie Souter, but we beat the Blackburn men that day, much to their surprise. Herbie Arthur, the famous Blackburn goalkeeper, went in goal and with his raincoat on. But when we put two past him, he soon took that coat off. We won 2-1 and they didn't like it. Hurst was recognised as a working class community, and in terms of contribution to Manchester soccer history, it was a pioneering club, helping the sport to transition from an inconsequential pastime performed on an ad hoc basis to a thriving community. If we want to move on to the next slide, please. So I think Hurst, it's only flavour there, but what I try to point out really is that a team like Ashton United, as Hurst became, is often neglected when people talk about the history of football in Manchester. But as a conurbation, Ashton was very much a part of Manchester, the railway lines, the newspapers, the media coverage. In fact, it was the Ashton Reporter that reported first on the games for Newton Heath and St Mark's in 1880. So, you know, Ashton itself was key to that, and certainly Hurst, Ashton United, was a prominent team. So at the same time as Hurst was developing, it is said that Manchester United first came to life. So I just want to read a section on Manchester United. It is the very beginning of Newton Heath, and there's one or two bits in here that may surprise people. Myths about the past have proliferated since the 1970s, and this is certainly true for football in Manchester, as both United and City have developed stories based on rumour, myth and inaccurate assumptions. At Manchester City, the daughter of the Reverend Arthur Connell has been credited with forming the club based on supposition and an inaccurate analysis of the facts. Don't get me started on that one. Similar supposition exists for United. It has been assumed that United, as Newton Heath, played a fully formed version of association football from 1878, but this does not square with the contemporary evidence and later interviews with founding members. In 1922, Herbert Dale, a railway worker at the time of the club's formation, who played as centre forward on occasion and continued to play during the club's Alliance League days over a decade later, provided his version of the club's transformation into a soccer club. In the 1920s, Dale was respected for his contribution to the game and was remembered as a prominent figure at Newton Heath. If anyone knew the truth of the club's formation, then it was Dale, who became a well-known and respected Football League referee and a significant influence on the development of football in Manchester, dedicating his time to the Manchester Wednesday League during its first 2 decades and being presented with a medal to mark his connection in 1911. Dale has explained that the club, when first formed, had a cricket team, presumably established in 1878, and that after some time, a member of the committee bought a football from a shop on Market Street in the city centre. This appears to have been in 1880. According to Dale, the instigator of the club was Sam Black, and the original colours were red and white quartered shirts. Although he's been named by others as a potential founder, this has been disputed based on his age in 1878. However, as no game has been identified prior to November 1880, when he would have been 17, it is possible that Black did propose and establish a soccer club or an offshoot of the cricket club during 1880. His age would be consistent with those of other founders, secretaries and captains of clubs in 19th century Manchester, such as Stuart G. Smith, a leading figure at Manchester Association, and those responsible for the development of St. Mark's in West Gorton. Black was a prominent early player at Newton Heath and later became a referee. The question of shirt colours has been debated by historians for some time. Both United and their fans accept that green and gold were the initial colours of the club, based on two sources. First, green and gold were two of the colours used by the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, and second, a Bolton newspaper report of the club's earliest known game is supposed to have stated the clothes worn as green and gold. This appears to be a foundation myth, developed at some point after the club had become Manchester United. In 1887, the club's colours were recorded as red and white, and no contemporary mentions of green and gold have been found. This suggests that the club's first choice of kit was red and white quarters as stated by Dale, who claimed to have been there at the time. Souvenirs of the period, such as cards bearing the club's name, are often red and white, and sometimes the colours are quartered, implying that green and gold was not utilised as the club's first choice of kit. It's really important, this, and I go into a lot more detail, so it's not worth me trying to read too much more about that. But it really is important. You know, obviously the green and gold campaign is based on this, and certainly Newton Heath did wear green and gold later, and may have worn it as an away colour. But the Bolton newspaper it referred to has never been found. I know somebody who was involved with writing the book that first mentioned this, and he admits he never found this newspaper, so whether it exists or not, I don't know. So I am absolutely convinced that red and white were the first colours worn by his team, and that Sam Black was the guy who at 17 years of age in 1880 created the football side of the club. It all fits. I go into much more detail, it all fits. So we can move on to the next slide, please. So that's Newton Heath, and of course I mentioned a myth there, and one of the passions of mine is to make sure that Manchester's football history is factually correct. Understandably, football clubs, doesn't matter whether it's red, blue, green, or what colour, will portray a story to strengthen their brand and their image over time, but it doesn't always mean that's the truth. And I think it's important that we all continue to investigate and analyse and try and find out the truth. So now I'm going to talk about the myth connected with Manchester City, and that is again about the foundation of a club. So before this, I explained quite a bit more, as I did with the last one, about the situation in West Gorton, just as I've done it about Newton Heath previously. But I'll start from this section here. Ever since the mid-1980s, the myth has developed of Anna Connell's role as founder of the football club, based on research in the 1970s by Tony Heap, which claimed that the cricket club, St. Mark's Cricket Club, was formed in 1879 directly from working men's meetings that Anna had established. He did not have access to material which has since made it clear that the cricket team predated the men's meetings by many years, more than a decade. By the late 1870s, the cricket club had proved relatively successful. Its junior players were the same age as many of the people engaged in scuttling, a form of gang warfare, and it is possible that some may have engaged in that activity. Church activities were unlikely to give the young men what they craved, nor would a drawn-out game of cricket produce the kind of excitement that they derived from scuttling. At some point during the late 1870s or early in 1880, someone promoted footballing activities within the church, and both rugby, people forget that or don't realise that, and association football teams were created at St. Mark's. Whether this was a counter-attraction to scuttling the gang warfare is not clear, but by autumn 1880, both sports had been so well received by the boys and young men of the parish that games were arranged. The first reported games for both sports occurred in November 1880. The soccer team followed the conurbation's traditional association route by playing a Cheshire-based club. Teams had to move south because that's where the soccer activity really was, while the rugby opponents were from the Manchester region. However, it was the soccer team that developed, not the rugby side, and several players, most notably Walter Chew and a later arrival, Lawrence Furness, remained active soccer administrators into the 1940s. Hume-born Chew who was interviewed about the formation of a club for BBC Forces Radio in 1944, has been regarded as the father of Manchester City by some, in numerous books, tributes and records over the years. However, Chew himself claimed that it was his older brother, William, along with some of his friends, who founded the club. In 1922, he explained that the older boys founded the St Mark's team and that they played at Farmers Field in West Gorton. One of the older boys, William Sumner, has been credited as the club's first captain, and his arrival in West Gorton around 1879 at the age of 18 coincided with St Mark's moving to both forms of football. He was an engineering student lodging in Gorton and was also a member of the St Mark's Cricket Club. In later years, Sumner also played for Manchester Football Club, appearing for them in an FA Cup tie against Stoke in November 1883. And that same season, he was possibly in the squad that travelled to Queen's Park for the first FA Cup tie ever held in Scotland. Chew outlined that St Mark's first pitch was Farmers Field, close to Thomas Street, a few hundred yards north of St Mark's Church. This site formed part of Brooks and Dox's Union Iron Works, where William B. Stowe, a church warden at St Mark's, was employed. He explains then a little bit more about Farmers Field. But basically what this says is that the fledgling club played its first reported game on Farmers Field on the 13th of November 1880 against the Baptist Church from Macclesfield. I can go on about City and United for hours, obviously, but I just wanted to give a bit of a flavour there that both those two professional clubs, that a lot of their early history is mistaken. A lot of their early history is not really known. If we can move on to the next slide, please. The whole myth of Anna Connell is one that drives me mad. It shouldn't. It's based on some research that somebody did in the 1970s that was published in the 1980s, and everyone just accepted it, and I fell for it as well for a while. But it was before 1976. It never appeared in anything. It was never mentioned. It was always the boys who created the club. So what else does the book cover? Well, it goes up to 1919. If anyone wants to ask me why 1919, then feel free to ask the question. It covers FA Cup finals. It covers the region's growth. It explains why Manchester became a soccer city rather than a rugby city. And believe me, Manchester was very much a rugby city until the early 1900s, really. Can we move on to the next slide? The whole point of the book for me really was to try and sort out some of those myths, to explain the development of Manchester, but also to use Manchester as a case study, really, because Manchester was such a growing conurbation that it didn't follow the pattern of typical Lancashire. It didn't follow the pattern of certain other areas of England, but as a case study, it perhaps provides clues as to how football has developed in other regions. And maybe, just maybe, you know, there are similar sets of circumstances. Communication was a big issue in Manchester. Railway lines were very important, but also international organisations, the International Football Association Board, for example, was set up in Manchester. And almost every aspect of players' union, all of this sort of stuff, was established in Manchester. I would never, ever claim Manchester as the home of football. Far from it. I don't think any city should ever be called that. But every element of football's development occurred at some point in that period up to 1919, and obviously in the years that followed. Can we move on to the next slide? So that's really enough of me in terms of talking about the book and so on. And now I'm keen to hear questions, and you know, would be delighted to answer any of those. So if you've got any questions, then please fire away.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks for that great talk. I've got a question. First one, a number of questions have come in. To anybody, please continue to send in your questions. I'll get round to them. First question, though, is just, could you just comment on how you did your research? You know, how you found these sources, this sort of wealth of information that you provided?
Yeah, sure. I've been researching the history of Manchester football for 3 decades now, and in the early days, I spent a lot of time looking at microfilms of newspapers and so on. Over the years, some newspapers have become digitised, but quite a lot of newspapers haven't. And I think one of the mistakes that some people have today is that they would tend to focus on online sources and try to basically carry on with what's been written before. I always start with the assumption that what's been written is wrong. And I try to look for evidence to prove that it's right, or to prove a different angle. I try not to accept. So the stories, for example, about Newton Heath, the quotes about Sam Black and Herbert Dale and all of that, I was really lucky that I went to a library and they had this newspaper that was produced in Manchester that was in really poor condition, that has never been digitised, that hasn't even been microfilmed. And I was allowed to look at this newspaper. And it was in such a frail condition that I'll probably never get to look at that newspaper again. I took as many photographs as I could. But the idea really was that I wanted to find out what people were saying. And some of the early founders of football, followers of football and so on, were interviewed in a series. And those stories were fascinating to me. I then obviously did what we call triangulation, checked that source against other sources and tried to work things out. So, you know, when you look at the player like Sam Black, he was 15 in 1878. Now, it is possible that he stood up in a meeting or whatever and said, let's create a football team. But more than likely is that he was 17 when he did that. And seeing as we couldn't find any football matches before November 1880 for Newton Heath, I think it's more logical. Then when you see that somebody says Sam Black was the one who created the football team, and then somebody says I bought the ball and it was in 1880, then it all sorts of adds up. So yeah, I spend a lot of time at archives, newspapers, photographs, diaries, anything like that really, anything to build the overall picture.
So yeah, okay. So you asked it. So you asked this question to be asked of the audience, and they brought it back to you. Why 1919?
I was glad somebody asked that, because people will think, oh, World War I started in 1914, but the Football League continued until 1915. So then people say, oh, 1915, you should end it then. But the truth is that something happened in Manchester in that last league season of 1914-15 that wasn't resolved until 1919. You have to read the book to go into all the details, but it's a situation that is in some ways relevant to what we're going through now. And it was connected with a game that was fixed. And in 1919, when the league was being resurrected, the sort of ramifications of that fixed game was still there. You know, was still relevant. And it ended up that the Football League decided that rather than punish a certain club or a certain couple of clubs, they would enlarge the top division. And the idea being that we don't want to relegate the team that was in a relegation position. We can't punish the other clubs. So let's just, you know, increase the size of the league. And it's very similar to what a lot of people are saying now about promotion relegation. You know, if football is resurrected at some point, will relegation actually occur? So 1919 is the end point, really, of a lot of those issues that were still relevant in 1914 and 15.
Okay, great. Thanks, Gary. So I've got a couple of questions on this one. So someone's asked, there's evidence of a religious basis for the support of clubs in Liverpool. Was there anything like this in Manchester, which has also been raised by another audience member asking about the Catholic-Protestant divide?
A few years back, I think it was the communications manager at Manchester United was adamant that there was no religious connection because Manchester United had been called a Catholic club. Obviously, Manchester City was started as a Church of England church team, so there was religion. But for both City and United, it's not relevant all the way through. You know, by the time Manchester City became Ardwick in 1887, the religious element had sort of gone away. It wasn't important. It wasn't seen as being important. When City won the FA Cup in 1904, they had a Catholic manager, a Methodist captain, Protestant players, a fan base that included a large section of the Jewish population of Manchester, which is mentioned in the book. And so religion wasn't there at all. People say, oh, well, you know, Manchester United were Catholic. Matt Busby talks about that. And Matt Busby and a guy called Louis Rocker did do that years later. But I think it's an exaggeration. It was never something that seemed particularly relevant in Manchester before 1919. Whether it was relevant at other times later on is another story. But certainly before 1919, those religious connections sort of disappeared. There's another myth that connects with United that they were going to be called Manchester Celtic. That's not true. That myth was established many years later.
Okay, thanks, Gary. So as a Hume born and bred man, I'm delighted we had Manchester's first football club. So where did Hume play their home games?
Well, it was difficult. There weren't many spaces really, but they did place at a place that was called Pooley's Park, which is Cornbrook. There's also a pub which is really relevant to the early history of Manchester football. And last time I checked, it was derelict, and that was the old Platford Hotel, and that's on the sort of on Stretford Trafford sort of border really. That's a really important venue. If I had my way, there'd be a blue plaque on there. And the Platford family are very important, and John Nall was a member of that family, so that's really important. They also, Hume Athenaeum was established on what was called Argreave Street in Hume, but they did play a few local, not even park pitches, fields really. The ground, Pooley's Park, that we played on, they had to move away from there because gradually buildings on the roads around it sort of encroached, and the grass just disappeared.
Okay, so with the rare exceptions, you mentioned Manchester missed the first wave of soccer development, football development, which regionally was centred around East Lancashire and Bolton. Why do you think, like a lot of South East Lancs, it broadly remained loyal to rugby whilst rugby was abandoned in East Lancs?
Manchester had a soccer club before East Lancashire. This is one of the other myths that I develop I don't develop it, I kill. Turton Football Club claimed to be the oldest club in Lancashire and still does claim that, and it wasn't. It's perhaps the longest survivor, but even Turton ceased to exist for a period of time and was resurrected years later. What happened was that Manchester loved rugby, and rugby was powerful. Manchester Football Club, which was the rugby club, which still exists, of course. It's now known as Manchester Rugby Club. It's the oldest football club, I suppose, that survives in Manchester. Manchester Football Club was very powerful in rugby. Soccer just couldn't really get enough clubs going until the 1870s, when there were multiple clubs. When it was just Hume, they had to go to Sheffield. You couldn't go to Sheffield for every game. You know, costs, the time, everything else. It just wasn't really possible. What happened in the sort of Bolton, Turton area of Lancashire was that there were multiple soccer clubs more or less straight away from the mid-1870s, and that was the difference. Manchester had multiple clubs from the mid-1870s. None of them were particularly good, and none of them were particularly influential on the Lancashire stage. What happened was that the key figures around the Bolton area eventually established the Lancashire FA, and although there was a team from Manchester that joined that at the beginning, the Manchester teams tended to look east and south for their rivals. So they played Stoke, they played Nottingham, they played Sheffield. That's where Manchester saw its rivalries. Manchester didn't really see its rivalries further up in Lancashire, because it was actually easier in some ways to get to Stoke and places like that. Plus, a lot of the Manchester key figures had connections with Stoke and Nottingham and so on. And I talk about some of those people in the book, those pioneering figures. Manchester, for many years, resented Lancashire's control. And the Manchester FA was fighting a battle. From the moment it was created in 1884, it was fighting a battle to be directly a part of the FA, if you like. Directly referring to the FA, reporting to the FA. Initially, it was told it had to report through the Lancashire FA, and Mancunians didn't like that. And Manchester, because of the towns like Hyde, Sale, Stockport, and so on, Manchester felt it was part of a different conurbation to that part of Lancashire.
That's great. In terms of the myth busting you've done in your book, have you approached any of the clubs with this, and what's their response been like?
Yes, I have. I did a presentation for one of them, and actually, they listened and it went well. It went down well, and they consulted me about a number of other things over the years. I didn't get a response off either one. I best not say which, but yeah, it's a tricky one, because if you've built your brand on a formation date or on a formation colour, and it's not that, it causes issues, doesn't it? Now, the evidence is in the book, and it's referenced and everything else. But yeah, the two that really bug me, I suppose, are the colours of Newtonheath and the Vicar's Daughter Creating City, and they just need killing off.
Some good questions on the kits. People asked why were specific colours chosen, say for Newtonheath, or someone asked why was the Maltese falcon on one of the kits, and how did you find out about the colour of the kits when obviously most of the photography was black and white, all the photography, sorry, I should say.
Yeah, in terms of the kits, it's mostly by descriptions, either in reports, yearbooks. Sometimes there would be, things like cigarette cards. There's a series of cards called Baines cards, which we sort of supported some of it, although they do go off down a number of blind alleys at times. The reason clubs chose the colours is really difficult. It's not clear. The white cross on the City shirts, well, the St Mark's, well, it's actually Gorton. It's not St Mark's, and it's not Manchester City. It's Gorton in 1884, which was a new club, and that's another myth actually that I'm trying to kill off. But the white cross is really difficult, because there are some that believe there are connections to, well, there's a campaign called the White Cross League, which was trying to sort of push people towards abstinence and various other things. It actually it's a different time. The dates don't add up with that. I actually think the White Cross does have a connection with the Gorton Masonic community. The guy who's supposed to have presented those shirts, and I'm still investigating some of that, was a senior figure in the Masonic community. Within Manchester City's history, they often claim that the blue was influenced by the Masonic community. That's not true. That ties in with a story from 1894, but as you can see by the kits, they were wearing blue before 1894. They were wearing blue and white before 1894. So that doesn't really add up. But I think the White Cross might have something to do with the Masonic community. Red and white, still not found out, still trying to find out. There is a possibility of influence by other clubs, but no, it's not 100% clear. And with some of the early clubs, it's more what they could get. When you were trying to find football shirts in the 1860s, they had to go with the rugby shirts of the day, basically, and what the local clothier had in stock. So yeah, unfortunately, some of the kits, it's still work in progress.
Okay, thanks, Gary. So this question is quite close to my heart. Someone from Stockport. So it says, understandably, the two big teams, City and United, get a lot of attention. But how much do teams like Bury, Oldham, I'm going to throw Stockport in there, and others say within that 8-mile, 10-mile radius, feature in your book?
A lot. But
just say,
what I will say is obviously the story ends with 1919. So Stockport weren't in the league until the 1920s. So Stockport, for example, as a football club, are not covered as much. But Stockport do appear. The town of Stockport appears. Oldham appears, but again, Oldham Athletic wasn't established until 1909. As Pine Villa before that. Obviously. But Bury Football Club is quite well covered because Bury Football Club was the first to find major success. They won the FA Cup twice before either City or United had even got to a final. And Bury's history really deserves some promotion, really. You know, their story was incredible. And unfortunately, what's happened to them since then is obviously, well, it's incredible, but not for good reasons. But yeah, a lot of the early history does talk about Bury. The book also covers clubs that people wouldn't even know today: Manchester Wanderers, West Manchester. It also talks about key events that took place in Manchester. You know, and the influence of lacrosse on the city and the city sporting landscape. You know, which probably surprises people, but Manchester is a prominent lacrosse centre because of things that happened when football was trying to establish itself, and lacrosse ended up the bigger sport for a while.
Thanks, Gary. So this is another great question here. So as well as the religious links, which you've discussed, there are obviously some industry links. Can you talk more? Is that a fair comment? Talk more about the industry links with regards to some of the clubs within and around Manchester?
Yeah. I mean, if you were creating a football club back in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, it needed a community of some sort. So some clubs were established from churches, like St Mark's, which became City. Some clubs were established from factories or from other works. So Newton Heath was established from the railway works at Newton Heath. Some clubs were established by an existing sort of community group. So the UMath, the name, for example, was a gym, a reading room. The whole purpose of that place was for sort of working class, middle class people to meet and to educate themselves, but also really for the men to sort of educate, learn, to communicate with each other, to get fit, to be good citizens. And the football club and cricket club that came out of there and other clubs, you know, helped to do that. So if you were living in 1870s, 1880s Manchester or the conurbation, there were some street teams established by kids in the main, but predominantly your football experience came from your work, the church, or another club, men's club, lads clubs, that sort of place.
Okay, so someone's asked, tell us a bit about Max Woosnam. Go into a bit more detail.
Well, Woosnam really sort of falls outside of this period. He's a post-World War player. I mean, Max Woosnam is an incredible sportsman. He was a Wimbledon tennis champion, doubles champion. He won Olympic gold. He was an amateur footballer. He played for Manchester City. He captained Manchester City in their first ever game at Main Road, which was a tribute. And at one point, he broke his leg in a game at Hyde Road. And as he was being stretchered from the ground to the ambulance, he saw a boy waiting with his autograph book. And he told the stretcher bearers to stop for a minute. He signed the boy's autograph and then was carried into the ambulance. There's lots of stories about him. He played table tennis against Charlie Chaplin with a butter knife, did all sorts of stuff. And he's a fantastic figure. But yeah, it just falls outside of this book, really.
Okay, thanks, guys. So the Football Alliance and the decision to put City into Division 2, so the scandal of 1905 and the match fixing of 1919 all sounds very political. Can you talk about the dark forces that shape some of these big decisions?
Right. Well, in 1892, first of all, both Ardwick, who became City, and Newton Heath, who became Manchester United, were applied to join the Football League. The Football League was creating a second division, and so any club was able to stand for voting for the first division or the second division. And we don't know for certain, and I don't want to create a myth, but Newton Heath applied for first division and Ardwick applied for second division. Now, there are two teams from Liverpool who both applied to go in the top division, and neither of them were accepted. I'm sure that'll please quite a few Manchester fans. But yeah, neither of the Liverpool teams were accepted. So I wonder if Newton Heath and Ardwick, who were exceptionally close, had agreed between themselves, well, you go for first division and we'll go for second division, and that's it. And Ardwick got in no problem. Newton Heath got in no problem. And I think that happened. I don't think there's any dark forces. I think it was perhaps the two clubs agreeing that. The bribe scandal, I assume we talk about in 1905. Yeah, read the book. It's the southern-based FA seemed to have an issue with some professional working class clubs from Northern England. Middlesbrough suffered. Manchester United had been investigated, and Manchester City were investigated and punished. It was the biggest punishment any football club had ever received. 17 players banned, manager banned, directors banned, and so on and so on and so on. When those players' bans were eventually lifted, Manchester City fans were desperate for Billy Meredith, who was the biggest star. He'd been the captain. He scored the goal in the 904 Cup final. They were desperate for him to stay in Manchester, and so was City. And he transferred to Manchester United. There's a lot more to it than that. It's all covered in the book. The 1915 match fixing, I think, is what people were referring to. Yeah, that was a game between Liverpool and United that was fixed. That's the one that led to the league being enlarged in 1919, because although many people believe the players were just trying to earn some extra money, the impact on United was that United avoided relegation in the end. There were games played after that game, so it's wrong to say that game stopped United from being relegated. But the 2 points that United got for that game were enough to make sure they were safe. They would have been relegated, well, it was 2 points. In 1919, Everton wanted United relegated. They were them punished. Chelsea, who were supposed to be being relegated, complained and wanted United to take their place. And the reason the league was enlarged was to satisfy Chelsea, basically, to keep United in that top division. But one of the interesting aspects that's never been reported on before, that's covered in the book, is that one of the investigating team was Charles Sutcliffe, who was very influential in the Football League, but he was also Manchester United solicitor. So if you're a United fan, it's great news. Read the book. There's a lot more to it than that. John McKenna, the Liverpool chairman, president at the time, was also influential. And when Everton had suggested that United should be relegated, he sort of responded saying, well, then we'd have to relegate Liverpool as well. And we don't want that, do we? And Everton didn't want that. So, yeah, there's a lot of shenanigans there. And you ought to read that. But it may not be as obvious as to why it goes the way it does until you read the book.
Thanks, Gary. So I've got one last question. Can you say something about the role of the FA Cup in Manchester's developing football culture?
Yeah, now if you've watched the English game, which is a fictional story, they're based on some truth. It tells the story of Darwin and then Blackburn. They play with the truth quite a bit, but basically, Darwin are this team that progress in the FA Cup until they meet a traditional sort of FA approved club, if you like. One of the teams that Darwin beat that season on their way was a team from Manchester. And the year before Darwin had even entered the FA Cup, a Manchester team entered the FA Cup. They had to pull out. And one of the reasons they pulled out was to do with travel, and they just couldn't do it. But it does show you that at this great moment, Darwin was certainly ahead of Manchester. They were a better team by some way. But a Manchester club was there in those right at that same point when Lancashire teams started to get involved in the FA Cup, if you like. As time progresses, there are some key games. You know, Manchester plays in Scotland and stuff like that. But really, the big point, I suppose, big early point was 1893 when the FA Cup final was staged in Manchester. And the main reason it was staged in Manchester was to try and convert Manchester from being a rugby city to being a soccer city. And so it was a big event, and it did influence Manchester. I mean, you did have City United as Ardwick and United in the league at that point, but a showpiece game between Everton and Wolves was significant. Wolves won, and in Wolverhampton there's a street which was basically dedicated to the success. It was called Wanderers Avenue, and it had a plaque on it marking the FA Cup final. Then it was 1904 when City won the FA Cup that really transferred Manchester into a soccer city, and the homecoming from that is probably what transferred Manchester more. It was an incredible night. Also, the 1904 FA Cup final was actually filmed. Unfortunately, I'm desperate to find it. It doesn't seem to exist anywhere. But for at least a month after the final, you could go and watch highlights of the final, including the goal, at various locations in the city centre, and also in Salford, and I think in Bolton as well. And that really brought the FA Cup home to the entire population. And after that point in 1904, attendances rocket. City become the best supported club in the league on at least 2 occasions, probably 3 occasions before football's abandoned for war. United's crowds grow as well. United's crowds grow. United, sorry. And football becomes a part and parcel of everyday life. Suddenly it matters, and it had never mattered to that extent before. And it's that point that made Manchester a footballing city.
Thanks, Gary. Really appreciate that. So I think that's a good moment to wrap up this armchair event, and to thank everyone for attending, but particularly thank you, Gary, for giving me the time to participate in some of the, the presentation and answering the questions has been great.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it. And, if anyone's got any specific questions, then please, get in touch with me through Facebook or Twitter or through Manchester University Press, and I'll see how I can help.
No problem. So for anyone who would like to get hold of a copy of Gary's book, so an email will follow. It'll come out tomorrow with details on how you can order a copy. It'll also contain a 50% discount off the RRP. Our distributor remains open and books are being delivered. So I just want to say thank you to everyone. If you're interested in these armchair events, sign up for our newsletters, follow Manchester University Press on Twitter, Instagram. But until next time, stay safe and keep well. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks.